BR Proud presents State of Addiction, what every family should know about opioids.
Good evening and welcome to our special, The State of Addiction, what every family needs to know about opioids.
Over the next hour, we're going to take a look at the growing epidemic right here in Louisiana, as well as hear from people directly impacted by addiction. We'll also talk about some great resources in the capital city to help people who might be struggling with addiction or know someone who is.
Well, we kick things off today with Jim Wahlberg. He's joining us now. Thank you so much for taking some time to talk with us today.
It's my absolute pleasure, and I can't thank you all enough for covering this very, very important topic.
It's something that impacts people all over the United States. The Mark Wahlberg Youth Foundation is now teaming up with the DEA 360 campaign to help address this issue by targeting youth with education and prevention tools. Why is that so important to get that conversation going with children about drugs early?
We warn our children about don't cross the street, stay away from strangers, don't touch the hot stove, right? And the opioid epidemic has killed hundreds and hundreds of thousands of young people, right? I feel like there's no child too young to have that conversation to warn them about the dangers, right? Because many of the people that ended up fully addicted to opioids and end up losing their lives innocently were given them by either a doctor or somebody who thought they were helping them because they had pain.
And you're now in charge of a pivotal program, the DEA 360 program. Can you explain a little bit about what that is for folks at home?
It's a marriage between the two organizations is what it is. And so, the DEA is more than a law enforcement agency. They're educating people, right? Because the younger you can get to people, the more information you can get them, the less likely you're going to have to see them a few years down the road. But when you say the DEA is coming, kids don't jump out of their seats, I think. But when you have the name of a famous name attached to it, and a celebrity, if you will, attached to it, I think kids are more excited by that.
And addiction is very personal to you as an individual. You're not just a face out here talking about a topic. You've been through this. So for you, why is it so important to address this and share this message?
By the time I was 12 years old, I was committed to the Department of Youth Services. That meant that the state was calling the shots in my life, not my family. And so from the age of 12 to 25, my life was a series of, in and out of jail, in and out of homelessness, fully addicted the entire time. And, and then I get this beautiful gift of recovery and I start to live this wonderful life. And I was making movies and doing my thing, and this epidemic was starting to affect people that I knew that lost their children. And I felt obligated to just be at least part of a conversation. My decision was not to spend the next 10 years out on the road doing events and talking about addiction and opioids in particular. But for lack of a better explanation, God had a different plan for me. Right. And I just have to follow the plan. I'm just following the plan and going along with the plan as best I can and trying to be of as much service and as much use to others as I can.
And that makes recovery sound so simple, but let's get real. I mean, recovery is not simple. Can you speak to that and how you overcame your addiction?
Yeah. Ultimately, what happened for me is that the messaging started to resonate with me. Right. And the gift of hope penetrated my brain just a little bit. It was just a passing thought. But after going to recovery meetings and being part of a recovery community, even though I was running game, if you will, the thought penetrated my mind. Maybe this can work for me too. Because the truth of the matter is people that are addicted don't feel worthy of recovery in a lot of instances. I didn't feel worthy of it, right? But, again, God had another plan for me.
And I understand that you do have a book out called The Big Hustle. If people want to learn more about your story, where can they find that?
So The Big Hustle is available on Amazon, and it's also available at oursundayvisitor.com. And it's my life. It's my life in addiction. It's my life in recovery. And it's it's not the story that a lot of people expect to hear when they hear my last name.
Well, thank you so much for your time and for being an inspiration and spreading that message of hope for people out there.
Well, thank you. And again, I just want to say how important it is that we're having this conversation in this very public way, right? Because when we do this, it helps to chip away at the stigma.
Still ahead, what exactly are opioids and what kind of impact do they have on your body? We'll chat with the head of Capital Area Human Services when we come back.
We're joined now by Dr. Jan Laughinghouse. She's the Executive Director of Capital Area Human Services. So just to start us off, tell us a little bit about what exactly opioids are.
These drugs actually are derived from the opium poppy, and those that are naturally occurring would be things that we think of like opium, morphine, codeine, like we get in cough syrup. And then there are the semi-synthetic and synthetic drugs that would be heroin, hydrocodone, buprenorphine, and fentanyl. Now, physicians and other prescribers are more judicious in their use. Many states have also put in laws and standards and regulations around how long the course can be, so how many pills can be prescribed at a time, and how long people can take them.
And you've kind of touched on the effects that they can have on the body. So why are they so addictive?
Opioids are very potent medications. And so when they are prescribed and they're used as intended, they can be safe. However, even when they are prescribed and used as intended, they create tissue dependence in the body. So even if I'm taking these medications for a legitimate medical reason, and I take them as I'm supposed to, I can become physically dependent on the medication.
And as the fight against opioid abuse continues, we've also been dealing with this pandemic. COVID-19 has been around for over a year now. A lot of people in isolation, dealing with mental health issues. How has the pandemic impacted substance abuse?
Unfortunately, the things that mitigate the spread of COVID-19 are actually very risky for people with opioid and other substance use disorders. Because one of the things that we talk about when we talk about supporting those folks is that they have to have a support network. So being around healthy others, gathering in groups, attending 12-step meetings, also going to group therapy. So when COVID came and we had these mitigation strategies in place and we needed to have them there, it was like pulling a rug out from underneath people who were actually in recovery and those who were struggling with the issues. Here locally in East Baton Rouge Parish, in 2020, we had over 245 opioid overdose deaths. That was double the number from 2019, and it far outstripped our rate of homicides as well. So it was a very deadly year because this is not just a local thing, that is happening nationally as well. We have to continue to educate folks so that they understand that people who suffer from this brain disease deserve the same compassion and physical medical intervention, just like people who have other physical health conditions as well.
It's certainly a very important topic and a very important time to continue this conversation. Dr. Jan Laughinghouse, we want to thank you so much for joining us and your efforts in this fight against this pandemic as well. Coming up next, the DEA is partnering with local law enforcement to help combat the opioid crisis and get the dangerous drugs off the streets. We'll have a look at their efforts coming up next.
Joining us now is Brad Byerly. He's the special agent in charge for the Drug Enforcement Agency. Mr. Byerly, great to have you back on the show. You said we're almost at a point to where every single person should be carrying Narcan on them.
Right now, our nation is facing a drug addiction epidemic. Last year alone, we lost over 83,000 people to drug overdose. So to kind of put it in perspective, Tiger Stadium holds around 102,000 people. So 80,000 people, that would almost fill up Tiger Stadium just in what we lost alone to drug overdose.
And obviously this is a growing trend. We're losing more people as we continue. Like, what's happening? Why aren't we able to fix this?
Well, we're doing a lot of things to fix it. One of the things that we're doing is called Operation Engage. And what Operation Engage is, it really is an alignment of the things that DEA does best. It aligns our enforcement efforts with our diversion and regulatory efforts and our community outreach effort.
So what are you seeing specific to Baton Rouge then that we need this program?
Well, what we're seeing in Baton Rouge, and I'm not just singling out Baton Rouge, the New Orleans Field Division covers 4 states, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Arkansas. And what we're seeing in all 4 states, and particularly what we're seeing a lot of in Baton Rouge right now, is the fentanyl. And we're seeing this fentanyl now in all of the street drugs, especially the pills. The pills are coming in from Mexico. Sometimes they're heroin laced with fentanyl. Sometimes they're the ecstasy, the MDMA laced with fentanyl. We're seeing the counterfeit Adderall on the street here locally, and it's got fentanyl in it. And these pills are not regulated. Some of them might have a little bit of fentanyl, some might have a lot.
Are there any other trends that you see relating to Baton Rouge, and how do we move forward at this point?
Yes, one of the other things that we're seeing, and this is something else that kind of keeps me awake at night other than the fentanyl, and that's the methamphetamine. We are seeing a gross influx of methamphetamine coming across the southwest border, and it's making its way into the Baton Rouge metropolitan area. So a lot of the investigations we're doing right now are not just little ounces of methamphetamine, but it's bulk methamphetamine that we're seizing at the pound levels.
So much for joining us today, Brad.
Good. Thank you, Kelly, and have a great day.
Of course, the work the DEA is doing would be much more difficult without the help from local law enforcement.
So joining us now is Chief Murphy Paul of the Baton Rouge Police Department and East Baton Rouge Sheriff Sid Gotro. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Chief Paul, let's begin with you. What is the most pressing issue locally right now when it comes to the opioid epidemic?
Well, when we look at the number of overdoses that we're having for a city our size, we had more than a 100% increase in overdose deaths last year. The current opioid epidemic isn't an individual issue. It's not a family issue. It is a community issue right now.
You just mentioned it briefly. We have seen a pretty big spike in overdose cases over the last year. How is this pandemic impacting the opioid crisis?
I don't know that's necessarily the driver behind the opioid problem that we're experiencing. I know it's got to contribute to it, but how much I don't exactly know. But I can tell you that we've seen a drastic increase of people that dealers, higher level dealers that are taking fentanyl and lacing it with heroin. It's a big problem, and that's really contributing to the overdoses that we're having to deal with.
Chief Paul, what exactly is the Baton Rouge Police Department doing right now to address this issue?
When we look at this monster called addiction, the systems that are in place, right? Those systems, whether it's counseling, peer support, all of those systems were interrupted during the COVID pandemic. We also saw an interruption in the drug trade. So one of the things that we're doing is we're following the data. So it's education and awareness, pushing that real-time data to service providers, asking them to go in those communities and do what they can do by educating family members, whether that's giving them a Narcan or naloxone to help in the prevention side. But we have too many people in our community that are dying from these overdoses.
We go after the upper level dealers. That's what we concentrate our enforcement efforts on. We're not trying to go out there and see how many users we can put in jail. That's not doing anything to address the problem. But from our standpoint, we do as much enforcement as we can and really go after the big dealers.
Chief Paul, how is your law enforcement officer team, how are they trained to approach a potential call like that?
But when it comes to tools that we're using now, we've been fortunate where we actually tax ourselves, and we have the Bridge Center for Hope. Now, that Bridge Center for Hope helps us deal with those individuals that we're dealing with who have a mental illness, but it also has a detox and services for those persons who are experiencing overdose symptoms. So that's been really good, because that's where they really get the help that they need. Look, taking them to jail doesn't really address the issue, but having a tool where we can actually drop off someone who's experiencing an overdose, where they can actually deal with it, has really been helpful.
And y'all mentioned helping the user, but a lot of this is coming from a supplier. So why is it so important to find these people that are supplying these drugs in our communities?
You know, we're dealing with people now that we know for a fact have connections with cartels. So, you know, to get those major suppliers, and then even intermediate suppliers, to get those people out of business, get them off the streets, that's going to help with that. But then you still have those addicts that are craving those drugs, and they have to have what Chief Paul mentioned is the support and the avenues, and have people there that are helping them deal with their addictions. The late Ronnie Edwards, one of our council persons, she said it best. Any effort on law enforcement is going to be short-lived without community involvement. And she's so right. And that resonated with me when she said it, and all through these years. And that's where, going back to what we talked about earlier and what the chief mentioned, we got to have community involvement at all levels, because this epidemic it doesn't have boundaries. It crosses all demographics, race, gender, age, economics, education. It affects everyone.
Well, we want to thank you for all that you do, of course, Sheriff Sid Gotro, as well as Police Chief Murphy Paul. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Up next, we talk to a woman who has made it her life's work to help other people process their grief after she experienced the tragic death of her son to addiction. We have her story next. Joining us now is Gwen Knox. She's an advanced grief recovery specialist. Gwen, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. Good to be with you.
Tell us exactly, what is a grief recovery specialist?
Well, as a grief recovery specialist, I help people to recover from over 43 different losses that we consider grief. Of course, at the top of the list is death, but there's divorce, retirement, loss of health, pet, whatever. But I specialize in dealing with those who have lost someone to the disease of addiction.
Can you tell us about the group Parents of Addicted Loved Ones? I believe that's PALS.
PAL is one of the actions that I took after my son's death. It was everything that I wish that I would have known while my son was still alive.
And what would you say to families dealing with the disease of addiction?
First of all, addiction is a brain disease, okay? Second of all, I would say that you did not cause this disease. Please stop blaming yourself. Just like you didn't cause it, you can't cure it. You can't put a Band-Aid on it, kiss it, and it goes away. Another thing I would say to families out there is it's okay to hate the addiction, just don't hate the addict.
And considering you have been through that horrible process of losing someone that you love to addiction, do you have any regrets? And if so, what maybe are your biggest regrets?
My biggest regret would be that I did not have the knowledge to truly understand that my son was suffering from a brain disease. I was very, very angry with my son. I looked at it as a life choice. He was ruining his life, and he was bringing a lot of grief into mine. So that is what I regret the most, that I used a lot of time being angry with my son, and now I can't go back and fix that relationship that we had.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your son, Brian?
There was more to Brian than the addiction that he suffered from. He was this little boy with these great big hazel eyes and a personality as big as his eyes. He was funny. He loved soccer. He was the life of the party. He never met a stranger. He stood up for the underdog. He was a great friend. His friends absolutely loved him. He took a wrong turn and could not find his way back, or either he was not willing to do the necessary hard work in order for him to have sobriety in his life.
Thank you for sharing. Gwen Knox, I thank you again for being with us today.
Up next, we chat with Dr. Brian Gross on the importance of having tough conversations about drugs with your children. We're joined now by Dr. Brian Gross, the director of the Psychology Department for the Capital Area Human Services District. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is obviously a conversation that needs to start early with your children. So how exactly do you talk to your child about misuse of opioids and drugs?
You can begin setting the stage for this open dialogue very early simply by talking to your child about what medicines are, what medicines do. And you can start that in elementary school.
How do you address the conversation if you might think that your child is dealing with substance abuse?
That can be tricky. One of the things that we know you don't want to do is to go in there guns a-blazing and say, are you using substance? So you want this conversation to be open, to be non-critical, to be non-judgmental.
What is the difference exactly between an addiction and then just experimentation?
Many high schoolers and even in middle school will experiment with drugs. That is not out of the norm. In fact, by the 10th grade, roughly half of teenagers have experimented with some medication, marijuana, alcohol, perhaps at a party once a month with friends. And there's no intent for this to continue in the experimentation stage, and that can quickly progress in some into what we call substance abuse or regular use. And finally, that can lead to what we call addiction, or what some people call dependence, where there are physical bodily cravings for the drug. You need much more of the drug to feel the same high. There may be withdrawal symptoms where a teenager or even an adult will feel nauseous and sick if they don't have the drug.
And if it does get to that point of addiction, how is addiction treated for teens?
Addictions for teens are treated similarly to those addictions for adults. It can be done on an outpatient basis, typically around once a week with a licensed professional substance abuse counselor or addictionologist. Then there can be what we call intensive outpatient therapy, which can be 2 to 3 times a week in individual settings and in group settings, again, with a professional substance abuse counselor or addictionologist. And then if one is not responsive to that, we have what is called inpatient residential treatment, which is typically up to about 28 days, where they get more intense 24-hour treatment by social workers, licensed professionals, psychiatrists, addictionologists, and that is typically followed by outpatient meetings.
Now, if parents are concerned that their child or teens might be using drugs or maybe addicted to drugs, what are some of those signs they should be on the lookout for?
You need to keep in mind that adolescents are undergoing a lot of changes, typical teenagers, so not every change you see in a teenager will be indicative of drug abuse or drug use, but you're looking for changes in a person's behavior. Often you'll see a change in your teenager's peer group. So it's important to keep tabs on who your child is hanging out with. You'll see those. You'll sometimes see loss of interest in activities that your teenager used to enjoy, like sports, working out, even video gaming. They may sort of give that up. Coming home at odd times. Coming home from school or work or going out with friends with bloodshot eyes where they seem intoxicated or sort of out of it, vomiting, there may be breaking rules, and in some cases you might see weight loss or changes in your teenager's appearance.
And going back to having that conversation early, what do parents need to do if their child asks if they themselves have used drugs before?
The old question, yes. Mommy, Dad, have you ever used drugs? Well, you don't want to lie. You want to deal with that with some tempered honesty. And I'll give you an example. When I was younger and I was in high school, there were teenagers and classmates and even friends who used drugs. And I thought they were kind of cool. And I wanted to know what those were like. So yes, I did experiment with marijuana. And if you experimented more than you wish to say, you can say, I experimented more than once, and maybe even too much. But I quickly found out that that wasn't for me. My grades started to drop. It led to problems at home. And I really kind of found out on my own, and it took me a little bit of time, that wasn't the cool thing to do because it led to a lot of problems.
Those are all great tips. Why is it so important for parents to be open and honest when having that discussion?
The last thing you want to do is be caught by your teenager as being dishonest or a liar. Then you lose all credibility. So being honest really helps promote what we talked about earlier, this ongoing open dialogue between you as a parent or caregiver or grandparent and your teenager, where your child or teenager feels safe talking openly about you. You want to let them know if they've ever experimented or used, that you will be there for them to talk about.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gross, for your time today. Next, we have a look at some of the resources available right here in Baton Rouge if you or someone you know is struggling with addiction, and why you don't have to fight this fight alone. Joining us now is Dr. Louis Cataldi. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Thanks so much for joining us. So a big part of this fight, of course, is treatment, and not just any treatment, the right type of treatment for each individual. Everyone's journey is different. So if you or someone you know is struggling with addiction, what are the steps that they need to take to help seek help?
You are so absolutely right that everyone's journey is different, although the process of addiction ultimately leads to disruption of the brain and the reward centers. The path of recovery can be different for different people. And with so many options to choose from nowadays, it's important that you choose the option that's right for you or right for the loved one who you're involved with. Unfortunately, sometimes these things happen rapidly where all of a sudden you feel a need to seek some type of treatment and you don't have a lot of time to shop, if you would. There are some ways to delay that, having to make that rapid decision.
And what should people be looking for when they are trying to find the right treatment facility?
It's extremely important that the patient or the person be matched to the appropriate type of treatment or the appropriate level of care. Treatment can go anywhere from going into a self-help meeting such as Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, to individual therapy, to outpatient therapy, to formal intensified outpatient therapy, to residential therapy, to sober living, to medication-assisted treatment. So again, it's extremely important to have someone knowledgeable to assess the person legitimately and help them find out the best path or journey, as you said, for them.
Now, treatment, of course, very, very important for the individual, but treatment also impacts the family. What can they do to support a loved one or a friend that's going through treatment?
Family involvement is something that is extremely necessary because this disease, as you know, not only affects the person who actually is the identified patient, it also affects the entire family system, and the family is being adversely affected by this process. So when you're looking at treatment centers, you need to know, everybody says, oh yes, we have a family program, but what does that mean? Does that mean I'm going to have one-to-one sessions with the person I love or my spouse? Does that mean I'm just going to have an hour of education? Exactly what does that mean?
What about emergency treatment or acute treatment? What's the difference there?
Luckily, in the Baton Rouge area, we've got the Bridge Center, which does a great job, by the way, and we have Baton Rouge Detox. The Bridge Center's philosophy is that there is no wrong door for entering treatment. And I think that's a major asset to our community. So you can, if you have an emergency situation, you can certainly go to an emergency room, but you also have other options. And a phone call to the Bridge Center of Recovery for Hope, is definitely worth the time and effort.
You mentioned having that support system, a support group, very, very important in that journey to recovery. But what advice do you have for someone who might be facing addiction alone and trying to seek help?
Recovery from any type of brain disease or any type of ongoing illness is a chronic recovery process, which is fun. It can be fun. It's rewarding. So going to treatment's not an event, is what I'm saying. It's the beginning of a process, or the renewal of a process. So and it's extremely difficult to do it on your own. For those particular people, you can find community support. All these places can offer you that fellowship and that extended family. There are sober houses that are available. Again, be very cautious and do your homework before you sign on with a particular sober house. You want to talk to other people who are knowledgeable in the field who can tell you, because sober house, some are really good, some are really bad.
All right, thank you so much. Lots of great advice there. Thank you again for your time today. Coming up, we talked to a woman from right here in Baton Rouge who's now in the recovery process. A look at her experience and how she found help. We're joined now by Ariel Butler and Alan Lee, both in recovery. Thank you guys both so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having.
So, of course, we're going to start now with Ariel. Talk a little bit about what led to your addiction. How did you get involved in using drugs?
Just like many other individuals that are, have gone through addiction, you don't just wake up one morning saying, I'm going to be an addict or I'm going to be a junkie. I was overly prescribed medicine, and that led me to heroin.
What happened that made you decide that you wanted to make a change, you wanted to seek help, and you wanted to start the recovery process?
I would like to say my kids and my family, but none of that got me to where I am right now. I did. Looking around and people being tired of everything, being sick and tired of living my life the way that I was. Going into my 30s and realizing that I have nothing to show for it. Realizing that I have nothing to leave my children. I looked around and I realized that I got me here. No one else. No one else got Ariel where she was but Ariel. So I had to get Ariel out of it.
And you've been able to kind of take this a step further. You started reaching out and helping others. So tell us a little bit about your organization and what you hope to do with that.
It's called Ariel's Choice. And it's called Ariel's Choice because, like I said, you have to make that choice. I did. Every day I wake up and I make that choice. So my organization, I want to have that dialogue and that open conversation with people that are struggling with addiction.
And it's a conversation that needs to be had. A lot of people, if they're not struggling with it personally, they know someone in their family, a friend that's been affected. Any advice to someone out there that's struggling with addiction or drug abuse?
The number one thing, like I said, is to just forgive yourself. Don't be too hard on yourself. Look around. You can make the little steps in your life, and it starts with those little things. Don't make huge steps. Don't be too hard on yourself, because when you set those high expectations and when you fail, it's a lot harder to get back up. So just start with the small steps, the little things, and I can promise you when you do that, you'll see that change, that manifestation will happen in your life.
We also have Alan Lee with us. Alan, tell us a little bit about your journey. What led you to get involved with addiction and using drugs?
Both of my parents suffered from addiction, and I was raised by my grandparents, so I really didn't have the guidance or authority that I needed to really send me into the straight line or get me back on track the way I needed to go. So I had a lot of freedom to do what I want. Really, it started off recreational at first, and I really had no idea of how powerful really like those drugs are or can be, or how much they can really take control of you in your life. Before I knew it, it grabbed me and I couldn't let go of it.
And that's a story we hear a lot, especially with young people. And nowadays it seems, kids are getting their hands on things sooner and sooner. So during your process, is there any one moment that made you realize, I really need to make a change and seek help?
I kept choosing this over my family and like what was best for me. The opportunities that was put in front of me and that I had made for myself, I would just wreck them within a short period of time. I have two beautiful kids. Whenever my daughter was born and I was in addiction, I wanted to stop for her. I wanted to be a good father. I wanted to provide for my family, be there for her mother emotionally and physically. I wanted to be a good man. My intentions was always the best. I wanted to do well. But the addiction was so strong, my actions always showed different.
And looking back, what lessons have you learned during your journey? Every journey is different, but I'm sure, looking back, there are some things that you learned about yourself throughout that process.
Always thought that it was always somebody else's fault. That I wasn't given the right opportunities, that people was always wronging me. That someone else was always to blame. It was never my fault. I was always the victim. But as I began my journey in recovery and started to really be aware and look back at it and look at myself, I was definitely the root of my problem. The mistakes and the things that I've made over my lifetime, it was from my own making. Like I said, no one made me do anything that I didn't want to do. I chose to start doing those drugs. I chose to continue it. I chose to do the things that I did to obtain those drugs. And now it's up to me to change that. It's up to me to make my future.
Well, we want to thank you both for sharing your story. And, we're so glad that you're both here to be able to share that story. So we really appreciate both of y'all's time.
We're joined now by State Attorney General Jeff Landry. Attorney General, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for joining us. According to the CDC, Louisiana ranked 15th in this country in overdose deaths per capita back in 2019. Why is addressing this issue so important for all Louisianians?
Because this epidemic is just tragic. It really is. I mean, you probably can't go down the road and find someone who hasn't been impacted by this epidemic. I mean, personally, I know a couple of folks, unfortunately, who ended up ending their life due to this particular addiction. And Louisiana has a unique problem. They're leading the nation in one of the top 10 states in the number of opioid prescriptions and addicts that are out there. And we've been trying to combat this problem for quite some time.
Can we talk more about that? Exactly how are we trying to combat this prescription overwriting?
We created a website that's called endepidemicla.org so that people can go and understand where they can get help or help their parents, their co-workers and others recognize the signs of addiction and the tools that can allow those that are addicted to get help. We've got a number of community outreach staffers that go out each and every day in order to educate people on the epidemic and where they can go to get help for their loved ones. We also recognize that over 60% of addicts actually start their addiction with someone else's prescription. So we made it a point to utilize drug take-back devices to encourage people to clean out their medicine cabinets. Because again, I mean, just think about it. If we could get people to lock up those opioids or certainly get rid of them once they're no longer needed, we may be able to cut addictions in half.
You've also been involved in some efforts on the state level in regards to the legislature and the session that's coming up. Can you speak to that?
We anticipate getting millions of dollars in settlement money from opioid manufacturers that we've sued. We believe that some of those settlements are imminent, and we want to ensure that those dollars actually go to those that need it the most in the most effective, efficient manner. We worked on a drug court task force, so we want to enhance our drug courts. And the end of that task force came up with a model legislation that was then filed, and is moving through the legislature. This will mandate a drug court in every parish. And what's important about that is that's true criminal justice reform, right? Because only 7% of those that participate in drug court end up recommitting some crimes.
Obviously, a number of things are in place to help fight this. So what happens next? How do we move forward as a state?
Well, look, I think we all move forward together. I think by educating ourselves, making people aware of the dangers of opioid use, we want to warn students and kids about the dangerous use of utilizing any of these drugs and how deadly this epidemic has become. So I think most importantly, it's about education.
Thank you so much for your time and your leadership in this fight. It is a bipartisan issue and where something we all need to work together on. Agreed?
I do. Thank you so much for helping in a very large way to educating people about the dangerous use of opioids and how we can stem this epidemic.
We want to thank you all so much for joining us for this very important conversation on the opioid epidemic and how to address the topic with your family and children. We hope tonight's program provides some useful information about the struggles of addiction and the impact it can have.
Just remember, there are resources out there to help people fight addiction right here in Baton Rouge. We've talked about many of those tonight, but we will be posting more links on our website, brproud.com, as well as in our free BR Proud app. That's also where you can find a live panel discussion that's going to dig deeper into those resources. That's going to start in just a few minutes.
From all of us here at NBC Local 33 and Fox 44, thanks for joining us. Have a great night.